That could be
Yeah.
argued, I think.
Well, part of my struggle is, there seemed to me a gap in your literature review that connected these concepts and things to your specific hypotheses. I wanted to see more introduction to the particular constructs that were relevant in your hypotheses. So, for example, I would have thought in your literature review, you would have clearly have gone through the four schools of thought. It doesn't need to be an immense, historical review, but tell me what the four schools were, how they are different, and then how those things correlate to or related to the dimensions of idealism and relativism, so that I would then get going into the hypotheses. To me, when you get to the hypotheses, when I read them, I go, oh, I get why you think that. And I didn't get that. And I think it's because both of you are so close into all the ethics stuff that it seemed intuitively obvious to you that everybody would know what these things were, and I don't.
Right.
And so it didn't, and so there was a big leap of faith for me from 2 to 3. So I think
Okay.
you need to be much more specific, and similar to that, the EPQ and the DIT, you didn't tell me anything about those instruments. I mean, other than you mentioned them, but why you use the EPQ for idealism, I mean, I know that's what it uses, but I needed to know why that was okay for some of your hypotheses, and yet you had to develop this other instrument for your other set of hypotheses.
Oh, yeah. So what I think the EPQ test is latent constructs, right? I mean, it's something that we really can't get at. Whereas the instrument that I developed was intended to test knowledge and the ability to apply knowledge to a fact setting, which is why I didn't run a factors analysis, because when I talked to the people in education, they said running a factors analysis would be inappropriate on something that tests pure knowledge, because it's
Sure.
not a latent construct.
And so you went through in your curriculum telling them specifically about, here's what it means to be virtuous, to
Right.
take an approach that's virtuous,
Right.
and blah, blah, blah. But you didn't have any of that stuff in the literature review about what instruction on virtue ethics would entail and how that would be different from what you tell them about deontological ethics. And I think that's absolutely
Let me
critical.
add to it, because I have a similar question, and I think I see some of what might fix it. In chapter 5, you had the research questions. I would expect to see that in chapter 1. And then I would expect to see your literature review focused around the research questions, and which link directly to the hypotheses which you state. And some of the stuff, when you did your hypothesis, you put some of your literature review in there describing the hypothesis, because you didn't do it earlier. And so sometimes there's a repetitiousness in dissertations. You have to go over it. But I think that's where it's missing, that it's there, but it's in different places. And so sometimes we get to a point and it's like, wait a minute, what's this? And later on you have it. So there's a little bit of reorganization, I think. That
Yeah,
might help.
it's a delicate balance here, isn't it? Because some of your review of the literature should be discussed right along with the hypothesis. Other parts, the more preliminary and the more general, you discuss first in the section that says review of the literature. You kind of pave the way. So then when you get into hypotheses, specific support for each hypothesis. And it's hard to do, to get that balance.
Yeah, but I agreed with Pookie. I felt like that there was some of that stuff should have been earlier in the literature review,
Yeah.
so that I'm more prepared when I see your hypothesis and I go, oh, now I know where it came from, and I know why he's doing it. So
Yeah, and I do think that was something that I talked to Dr. Hyman about, is that I guess because that's sort of my area of what I like, that I just sort of assumed more than
So close,
what
yeah.
other people, and so Dr. Hyman's suggestion was actually to do another appendix, which I'm more than willing to do, that sort of lays out what these terms are and how they correspond to the EPQ.
That'd be helpful,
That'd be
really
helpful,
would.
but I think you still need a few sentences. I mean, I think certainly
Yeah.
the detail can be relegated to an appendix, but I just felt like there was it didn't flow that smoothly between 2 and 3. It just felt like,
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, and I mentioned there are some specific terms where I said, define it here, just briefly anyway. And you can put them in a table besides, that would be
Right.
really nice. But you need something as you're going along, for those who aren't as familiar, to remember. Same with like a lot of your abbreviations. By the time I'm like in chapter 4, 5, it's, what was this one again, you know?
You have to go back, don't you?
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, quite a bit.
And if you're recollecting data, I mean, you're collecting more data, and I don't know how you might do this, but one of the variables that I would have liked to have seen is the deed dependent variable. And tell me if I'm wrong, if it would be relevant, but early on you made reference to a study by, I think it was you and Danthu, or,
Uh-huh.
and they used ethical sensitivity as one of the, looking to see, I guess it's that, in my mind, although again, I didn't see really clearly what the definition of the construct was, I'm assuming it's something along the lines of an awareness or a recognition that there might be an ethical dilemma here. And if in the next data collection you did that, you included that as a measure, if there's a simple measure that exists already,
It
I
does
think
exist.
that might be a
You don't
good,
even remember it, do you?
what?
Do you remember the ethics assessment quiz that I developed? The 40 vignettes? Do you recognize that this is an ethically problematic situation, yes or no? So you can just borrow that one. We've already got it.
Yeah, but that's not
Yeah, I
sensitive.
think so.
Yeah, it is. They're insensitive. If they identify an ethical problematic situation as being non-ethically problematic, then they are insensitive.
Well, but aren't all of his scenarios problematic? I mean, are there any in there that are not problematic?
They are problematic.
So, I mean,
The scale that I developed.
No, I'm telling you a different scale, not his scale. I'm saying there is you said if there's an existing scale. Yeah, I developed one for the department. We've got one. And what's more, I've got data on that scale for 10 years. So he can norm all he
well,
wants.
what did you and Dantho use in measuring that?
That I don't remember.
I'm just curious, I would
don't.
think, because that one was a fairly extensive scale, I assumed that theirs sounded like it was a more, but anyway.
Remember, he's
Yes.
got an entire semester to
Yes.
collect his data, so you can easily give him those 40 items. I don't think, judging from how long it takes my students to complete that instrument, it's going to take them more than a half hour.
You say 10 years history? on
I've
that
got
one?
10, yeah, because I did it for the department and I put it up on Canvas, and I still give it to my students every semester for extra credit, and most of them do it. So I have got hundreds and hundreds of responses. So I'm sure that we can make sure that
Yeah.
the instrument is reliable and that the alphas are okay and all that good stuff.
I noticed the reference to that study,
Uh-huh.
and to me, what I thought was missing was just a clearer definition of effectiveness in teaching. And it's there, it's like hidden in there, but it
Mhm.
could be brought out more relating to those measures and
That
things.
these are
that-
the
how
desirable
am I
outcomes
me-
for,
Yeah, how am I
instruction.
measuring success,
Yeah.
basically, and effectiveness, you call it effectiveness, but that's it's a mushy term.
yeah.
In terms of success, I want to grant you showed that the small business cases work better seem to be more effective
Mhm.
in imparting the ethics. Why would that be?
Because I think that they can actually relate to it, and then when they see a fact pattern, they can say, "Oh, this applies. This applies to that fact pattern. I've seen this before." I don't think that the corporate cases give them that, because if you ask students, for example, in my class, if they understand Enron, they all say they do, and then when you ask them what that means, there's no explanation there.
So are you
So-
gonna assume that corporate training should use corporate cases?
I would assume that corporate training should use cases appropriate to the level of the trainee. So if you're looking at HR individuals, I would think that you would need to train HR differently than you would train accountants.
Likewise, wouldn't you have different training for those that are higher up in the hierarchy?
Yes.
CEO
Yes.
and CMO.
So I think
Versus
simpler
a-
cases would be appropriate for lower level corporate employees, and yes,
Something they could relate
Right.
to specifically, personally.
Well, then what would you think would be, do you think it would have a difference if you're dealing with someone who has no corporate experience but has 20 years of experience running a small business?
yes.
Yes, what?
I
Which should
think
they?
that- I think that they would relate more to small business cases. Now, I think
But
gathering
see-
the data on that would be more difficult, to
Well, I guess
find
that's what
small
I'm trying to
business
see,
people,
is
but-
it, because it seems to me you were trying to say that, I mean, the extent to which students relate to something, and because the things that happens in small businesses is more about personal values or interactions and things than corporate litigation and rules and, you know, or whatever. But that's the thing, I'm not sure, it'd be interesting, and I think you need to think through whether you think a student who has absolutely zero business experience and is just life experience versus an experienced small business manager who has zero corporate experience, but tons of business experience versus the very experienced corporate person, where the small business cases versus corporate cases would work with each. Because what you're saying is making it effective for students is a different thing to me than saying that that would then automatically make it effective for very
corporations.
seasoned
Right.
small business
Yeah,
persons.
I guess the thing that I'm thinking about is that given the economy and the fact that most students will start out in a small business,
Mhm.
this is going to be more something that they will be able to relate to and apply in going to work for the local CPA
Mhm.
firm or the local restaurant chain
Mhm.
or something like that than they can if they're looking at Enron.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting along this line. Research has shown that small business tends to, managers in small business tend to have a much shorter time horizon than those in larger business. Small business tends to deal more in expediency. Oh, what happened yesterday, we better deal with that. Whereas larger firms at least attempt to plan and look at the long run and what would be the effect. So I wonder still, would the small business cases still work for the people that are working for Enron or GE or something like that? It's a different time
I would think that for those employees in the corporate world, the idea would be to develop case studies that are relevant to the specific aspects of the business. So when you're in HR, you don't necessarily, I mean, it's for CEOs, CFOs, those people are obviously focused on broad issues. And I mean, that's well developed in literature, that they have this sort of overarching, and they don't necessarily understand. As one of my friends who's a CIO says, I don't know about management information systems anymore because I'm so focused on budgets and things like that, as a manager he's become less effective if he has to actually go and try and fix something.
I think there's actually two questions embedded in that issue, that how you teach students pattern recognition, sort of, like that this is a dynamic, this is a principle, an ethical thing. And then the second part is, how do you apply it in a different context? So I think that by separating it, to me, it seems like the reason it works so well is because you don't confuse the two. When you start with the smaller issue, they don't have to understand the large business context, which is more complex. And so you're not doing both at once. If you take it step at a time, maybe that's why it works better. So I thought it was nice that you separated that out to look at it both ways, because they do have research that shows that if you teach people sort of that pattern recognition thing and then lead them step by step through how you transfer that knowledge to another context, then they're able to apply it better. They're able to use it in more...
Kind of like framing in psychology, where you move a bit at a time.
Yeah, they use it in creative problem solving. So if you show someone how you take a principle from one context, they can take it into a different context. Like years ago, I talked to somebody who said, I'm in marketing, but I don't know how this applies to healthcare. And I thought, why can't he see that? But that's a separate skill, learning to apply it in a different context.
Yeah.
Well, and so that's the thing in your future research, that second one that you said you were gonna try and manipulate
The cases, so that
increasing
they're
shades of gray and
Uh-huh.
nuance. Part of the thing I wonder is if there might not potentially be somewhat of a confound in your two conditions, that it wasn't so much small business and corporate, but that it just happened that your small business had less shades of gray overall than the corporate.
See,
And
I
if
think
there
the
would-
small business has more shades of gray than the corporate. So if you look at one of the case studies, involves a beer special, and I got the idea for that case study actually by the game that they play right across the street at Dublin's here, which was one of Dr. Moore's least favorite nights to go to Dublin's because They had the geeks that drink at
Yeah.
night, and it was highly annoying.
Noisy,
So-
very noisy.
So I think that's a much more subtle issue.
Well,
Then
I guess
again-
what I'm saying is what you might want to try and do is do a little more pre-testing of your cases to see if you can get clarification on complexity of the case versus context of the case. And that might be, you know what I mean, I'm just a little concerned that there might be a confound between the context and the complexity, what she's talking about.
That
And so
could
if there
be,
would
yeah.
be a way that if the cases had, you know, you had highly complex small business, highly complex corporate.
What makes a
simple-
case complex?
Well,
He's
I
just got to
mean-
define that term if he's going to differentiate his cases based on it. So I'm not saying you can't, I'm just
no,
saying,
and
how
that's,
do you
I
define
know,
it?
I understand that, but the language that he used, I think it confuses the issue a little bit. Because, I mean, the way he justifies, I mean, you know, the small business is good for students because so many of them are gonna go into small business. Well, they're not there yet either. They're not in corporate and they're not in small business. So
Mhm.
why would something a priori be more or less relevant to them? They haven't been in either context.
Okay.
I think most of our students do work. I mean, I think they have some, most of them work at a restaurant or do some, I mean, they have some working. I know very few students that don't have some job, that have
Right.
not had some job, in high school. So,
Well, I think, so that's what I'm saying. I think I wonder if what's being manipulated here more is lower level management issues versus executive level management issues, as opposed to small business corporate. You know what I mean? So if some of those cases are dealing more with things like, my employee's late every single day, how do I get them to change? Oh, I find they have a sick child, blah, 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 versus this is Enron, they're cooking the books, and, you know what I mean?
It wasn't just small business, it was personal/small business.
Again, that's what I'm saying. I think some of this stuff is going all mixed together. I think
Yeah.
you're fine with it, but when you're doing your next study, I think you might consider that I think you are mixing apples and oranges a little bit.
So you think there ought to be personal studies, small business study, corporate study? That lumping personal, small business together is the problem.
Yeah, probably because to me, it's more business issues versus personal value issues. I mean, because it's some of the times when you're talking to me about this, you're saying they understood these cases because these are kind of things that they face almost on a day-to-day basis, regardless of whether it's at work or anywhere else. It's a dilemma that they might confront day to day, which I think is far more relevant than is the setting of the case a small business or a corporation.
Well, fortunately, Grant knows somebody who, as part of the Daniels Initiative, had to write 4 of those personal 1,000-word cases. So he's got 4 he can test next time.
Yeah,
So they're
I
already
don't know.
done.
I'm not telling you exactly how to do it, but I'm just saying, I
Yeah.
think that might be something that might come up.
No, but that's easy enough to do
Well,
because
I
the
mean-
cases already exist.
I agree that the confusion between what's the difference between a small business case versus a corporate case it's a little bit
Right.
mushy there, but maybe it's cleaner if you just say personal decision within a business context versus corporate level behavior.
That could get at it that way, yeah.
And separate that thing. And I think that rather than saying it's a big thing about whether it's a small business or a corporation,
Mhm.
I think what you've discovered is more what works with this population of students who don't have that, mostly don't have,
Yeah.
they're undergraduates and have that experience of the higher levels of corporate behavior, which is hard to teach in OB.
Right.
Right.
It's real hard for them to get that idea
They can't
of the
empathize
structure and the
with
bigger
persons in that
issues.
context, because they have
Yeah.
no idea what that context
Yeah.
even looks like.
Yeah, so I think it's a valuable finding, and maybe just change a little bit the way you express what you found.
Yeah.
One of the things that I will add, I mean, in terms of looking at this and the difficulty, is that it is very difficult to say there's really no definition of what is a small business.
Right.
I mean,
That's the other thing.
I worked for a publicly traded corporation that was traded on the NASDAQ, but we had 35 employees total. We outsourced all of our sales management to a group of independent distributors, and yeah, we were publicly traded. I would not have called it a big corporation, and so I have yet to find a really good definition of what constitutes a small business.
The Small Business Administration has wrestled with that for years.
Yeah,
And it varies so much by industry.
Right.
Obviously, in the finance industry, the top financial firms, the big banks, so forth, it would be quite different. What's a big and a small business?
Right.
Compared to, for example, the plumbing industry.
Well, and if you look at even, for example, Berkshire Hathaway, it depends on how you count. I mean, Berkshire has hundreds of thousands of employees if you count everything that it owns. If you just look at Berkshire, it's not that big.
Well, I
Yeah,
also
I mean-
wonder if some of it gets down to the thing, if you talk about, and I should go back and look at your cases again a little bit more specifically, but